I'm sure we'll get a couple people that will be calling in, and you'll let in as well.
I was just going to say it's
So
probably good to tell people too, if you hit the view button and do side by side with speaker, then to your point, Z, there'll be people joining off and on, but then you can keep the 5 speakers pinned next to the slides.
I've got
yeah,
pinned up there as well, so hopefully I'll stay there at the top.
okay. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Again, appreciate everybody calling in today for this webinar. Again, this was something we came together with the Texas COTE committee and just said this is something important for us, and we wanted to kind of maybe set up a discussion about it today. So if any questions at all, again, Becky and Caitlin are on the line to help with questions. Definitely want your Q&A to go through in this as possible, and we'll get started. Again, this is an AIA-approved course, so if you, again, need CUs, definitely reach out to Becky or Caitlin, and they'll help you with that. It's nice enough to have 4 friends of mine join this discussion with us, and they're going to kind of introduce themselves in just a little bit. They all have a couple slides to talk about themselves, their company, and all that, so I won't get into that right now, but Allie's in Austin, Ellen's in Dallas, and Jill's in Houston, so well represented for Texas. And then our good friend Z is in Louisiana, so he's our next door neighbor. So glad he was able to join us as well. Again, we're just going to do a couple quick slides for introductions, but obviously a lot of the time wants to be spent on discussion, wants to be spent with you all asking questions on how we can help you all with your firms and your companies as well, not just talking about ourselves. So definitely, again, ask questions as needed, and we'll definitely try our best to get all the answers to you. We can share this presentation with you as well, and we're recording it. So if you need to watch it later on or share with others, you can as well. The hope is that most people on this call at least understand a little bit about the 2030 challenge and commitment. If you don't, please let us know. We do have some resource links here to a lot of the information for this. So again, if you're not as familiar with what we're trying to do with AIA 2030 commitment, feel free again to reach out and look at these links as well, and hopefully that will help you. A lot of us work on this, full time or are very familiar with it. And so you're going to see a lot of terminologies go back and forth between the speakers. And so in case if you're not familiar with some of these terms, I put a couple up here just to kind of share with you. We'll talk about the DDX, which is again a platform where we're kind of tracking our information for the AIA 2030 commitment. And Z is going to dive into that a little bit more in just a bit. EUI again is looking at energy use. Where lighting power density, again, is obviously just specific to lighting. And a sustainable action plan, again, is what a lot of us have done for the 2030 commitment. So again, if you're not familiar with these terminologies, again, happy to help afterwards. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Z.
Sure. So the 2030 commitment was AIA's, oh, go back one if you would. Was the AIA's response to how to engage and implement the 2030 challenge, which was to get off fossil fuels by 2030 in the building sector. And back in 2005, when it was first devised, 2030 seemed like a long way away and a lot of things could happen. To sort of simplify things, AIA said architects work on a lot of different kinds of things, but broadly what we're going to talk about is the energy use of our buildings, and then we all work on interior renovations that are kind of light touch interventions in buildings where it may be the only thing that impacts energy use that we have control over is that maybe we're changing out the lighting. And so they created these 2 categories for tracking. One is the total use of energy of the building, and it's calculating its consequences to the environment, and the other one is to light efficiently. And so with that, let's move on and talk, well, how do you measure energy? Next slide, please. So the way that they chose to, rather than have you calculate up the carbon that your buildings were emitting back then in 2005, 2009, it was kind of tough. So what they did was we're going to just convert energy and electric use to one common unit. This being America, it's the kilobtu, British thermal unit. The British don't use it anymore, but we do. You add those things together after doing a conversion, and you just divide by the floor area. And so you get this EUI, energy use intensity. So if you look at a typical house in America, typical house might use 12,000 kilowatt hours of electricity in a year, 100 cubic foot of CCFs of natural gas. You turn them into their energy content. It's 120,000 kBTU. You divide by a 2,000 square foot floor area, and you got an EUI of, in this case, 60. So this was a number for an old house. New houses are usually better than that. Next slide. But of course, different building types typically have different energies. So if you're a firm that's doing all single family homes, you'd like to kind of know how you're doing versus single family homes. If you're doing, office buildings, schools, whatever, you'd like to have the appropriate thing to know you're running against. And so there's this great survey done by the Department of Energy every 3 years called CBEX, Commercial Building Energy Consumption Survey, and REX for single family residential. And they get thousands of buildings worth of data, they get the EUIs, and they publish them. And so the 2030 challenge said, we're going to take this fixed starting line and say, starting in 2005, you ought to be able to we all know we can make buildings that only use half as much energy as the average building out there. That average building could have been built 100 years ago or 10 years ago. You average it all together, and then you go 50% savings, then 60%, and then in every 5 years, it's like doing the limbo. The little bar would get, the bar of performance would get raised, or the bar of energy use that you should use it gets lower. And as you can see, like you've got some building types like laboratories or fast food restaurants where the average EUIs are huge. But again, you want to compare to your building to the others of the same type. Next slide. So that's EUI. Now, what if you're doing mostly interior renovations? Well, the thought is, if it's not your fault because you're not changing the building envelope, you might not be changing the mechanical system, just moving around the registers. So what can you do? Well, you could at least track how much lighting you're using. And you could get into trying to model when the lights are switched on and off and all that. But one thought was, well, the worst you could do is like leaving the lights on all the time. What's the maximum total power? And then divide that by the floor area. And as you know, different building types, again, have different budgets in the energy code for how much lighting they're kind of need that's appropriate to use. The 2030 commitment uses the ASHRAE 2007 standards. And as you can say, if you look at a modern code like IEC 2021, those allowed power densities have gotten lower because lighting's gotten more and more efficient. Next slide. So we have these two ideas of energy use and lighting use. The 2030 commitment has this target of higher and higher savings, where your savings are weighted by the it's how you are compared to the average of that one building type, and then weighted in your portfolio by the floor area. So you have, if you have a bunch of really huge projects, they count for more of your footprint, and therefore they get weighted more heavily in your total portfolio average EUI savings. Like in lighting, what they're looking at is just, can you do 25% better than the 2007 energy code? Next slide. So when the firms since 2009 have started, when the reporting began, I've got data here compiled for the firm-wide portfolios added together of all the firms. They don't report out when you sign up. Your data goes in anonymously, but it all gets thrown into the soup, and they say, how are all the firms that are reporting that year doing? And of course, as more and more firms sign up, there's a lot of newbies each year, so they're just getting going, and so that kind of holds back the performance average versus the firms that have been there longer and honing their techniques. But the average firm-wide savings of the entire profession, which now accounts for more than like a third of all the commercial floor area being built, is around 50% savings from that 2003 baseline. And lighting power densities we're seeing are typically now doing better than that 25% threshold, better than the old 2007 energy code. Next slide. Now, my own firm, our story was, we signed up in 2009, and then somebody kind of poked us in the side and said, by the way, you're supposed to report. And so in 2011, we started reporting how we're doing. And we knew that we were not only not meeting this target of what was then going to be 60% energy savings, but we were worse than the average AIA reporting firm. But we decided, life in Louisiana, it's all about confess your sins. So we posted how we were doing, and we said, we know we have to do better, but here's how we're doing now. And then we implemented sets of practices that slowly but surely improved our performance over time, so that in 2023, our portfolio average savings is 69% firm-wide. Likewise, our lighting power density savings Some people say that our lighting mantra is dare to be dim or something, but we've always gotten much higher savings than the 2007 baseline. Next slide. So what we've been, then you take these things and how do you track all this stuff? Used to be you had to enter everything in these endless spreadsheets and it was a big pain in the wazoo. But now there's an online website where you just enter every single project that you want to report. Now, we all have little projects that were like a funny little programming study that we did in a week and a half for a client, looking at what you could do with a piece of land. Not every single project gets reported. It's what you should do is start with your biggest projects and work your way down your list of projects and thinking in terms of what's the impact. And again, you're going to track whole energy for whole building interventions or whole floor interventions when you're changing the HVAC and so on. And then if you're just changing out the lighting, then just check the lighting power density. Next slide. And the neat thing is when you do that, you press this magic button at the when the time it strangely corresponds to when you have to do your taxes at the end of March. You make sure you've reported everything, and then you say upload the report, and it chunks through your whole database, and you see, oh, okay, this was your savings on energy. You also say whether or not you've done energy modeling, and then it says what's your lighting power density reduction. And lots of other things get compiled, and those get aggregated into a nice report that the AIA puts out every year. And you can kind of see how you're doing and learn lessons from other firms that are doing great work. Next slide. So we're doing, we work for a lot of different kinds of clients. We have some clients who have very high environmental aspirations. We have other clients that will let us do something as long as we don't tell them that it's about sustainability. And in fact, we recently had a huge project commit to using low carbon concrete, and they wrote the letter authorizing saying, we're not doing this for environmental reasons, we're doing because it's cheaper. So you may have clients like that too. But what are the practices that we put in place that we at least attribute why we're doing better? We really do encourage energy modeling, certainly on all our large projects, and our large projects tend to dominate the total floor area of our whole portfolio. We do embodied carbon because we're all realizing that the carbon to make the concrete and steel and glass is such a big fraction now of the overall the life cycle carbon emissions of a building. And the neat thing is, there's this very detailed thing that will plug into your Revit models called Tally that you can do for carbon accounting. But in the last 2 years, there's been this great tool that's free online that's like scarily accurate at giving you early guesses as what the carbon footprint is, depending on where you are, which kinds of concrete you're using and so on. And that's called Epic. So I highly recommend people look at that. And we've been able to do that. It takes like 10 minutes per project to go through and get initial senses of the carbon footprint of construction. We also made a firm decision a while back to just, we were going to pretend that we lived in our own bubble with the most recent energy code. And then the neat thing is Louisiana, in an uncharacteristic move, actually moved to the most recent energy code, IECC 2021. We just apply that everywhere, and we know we can do that in good conscience because these codes have already been checked for cost effectiveness. So we know we're doing the client a favor by designing to the more recent energy standard, even if we're working in a jurisdiction that isn't up at this latest code. We've found that we can use pretty uniformly always target about a 50% savings in lighting power density. Because what we find is a lot of our lighting engineers, if we weren't kind of watching what they were doing, would tend to say, look, I have this many watts. What's the most? I'm going to spend the maximum because that's my budget. And what we said was, no, we want you to light it to the light levels that the lighting standards say. You tell us how much energy that is, but we expect you should come in at around 50% savings because we find that with modern LED lighting, that's pretty easy. The other thing we've done recently that's helped a bit is we've started doing what we call phase gateways, which is whenever a project transitions from pre-design into SD, SD to DD, DD to CDs, we do a check-in where we initially set goals and we say, how you doing now? And that is a sobering moment on some projects. And it's an opportunity to say, well, what could we do? How can we help? So it's not a moment for like spanking anybody. It's a moment to sort of say, you got some problems. Let's get some resources to try to tune up that project. That's it. Thanks.
Great.
Next slide.
Thanks, Z. So any questions so far? If not, again, definitely put your questions in the Q&A or in the chat. Okay, Ellen?
Okay, so I am with LPA Design Studios. We are an integrated design firm, meaning we have architects, engineers, interior designers. We are about 500 people, headquartered in California, but having offices in California and Texas. So we do work everywhere, but we are heavily concentrated in those two states, which has been interesting because they're very far apart in many, many ways. We signed on to the 2030 about 10 years ago. We were not one of the early adopters, but we did manage to hit the goal as sort of Z laid out. The percentage of improvement increases every 5 years. So in the 5-year range where it was 70%, we were able to hit that between 2019 and 2020. And we've been sort of following it upwards, but I did want to sort of point out in the spirit of transparency that we took a very noticeable dip last year. So we went down and we decided that we were going to own this and be pretty forthright about it and use it as a wake-up call and an opportunity to do a little bit of self-reflection and figure out kind of what was going on and what was causing us to head in the wrong direction. Can change, advance the slide, please. So one of the things that we implemented was monthly progress updates, and I was gonna make a joke about tax season, but Z beat me to it. But we decided that we were going to start reporting on this internally monthly, and there were a number of reasons for this. One is we wanted to catch the problems earlier. We had way too many teams that were scrambling to do energy modeling at the end of the year and using it as kind of a reporting exercise instead of a design tool, which was the intention. So we thought, okay, maybe we can just catch those a little bit earlier. And I think as Z was saying, we don't want it to be sort of a punitive thing. We want to be able to help teams figure out where the problems are and sort of show them how they can use it as a way to influence their design decisions, especially those early phase ones that are free and that are going to go over better in markets where we don't have high stringent codes like Title 24 in California. And then next slide. So we also wanted to send the message to the entire firm that this was important. And so you will see this slide at every monthly firm-wide meeting that we have. We call them all hands meetings. And this is a chart that goes month to month and it updates every month that really gets granular about how many projects we are tracking that are active, how many are updated, need updating, how many have no data. What you don't see is that there's a subsequent slide that goes to leadership that calls out the projects that don't have any data. So sometimes we do have a little less carrot and a little more stick because public shaming does work as long as we're doing it internally and in the spirit of competition. But again, this is sort of all going back to the notion that this needs to be top of mind. You'll hear our leadership talking a lot about institutional memory is 90 days. So we need to say every 90 days if we expect people to pay attention to it. So this is actually on a 30-day rotation, which is even more stringent. But it is sort of in an effort to get us past this sort of tax season accounting exercise and into a methodology by which we are using this as a design tool.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think, am I seeing some questions? Let me see real quick on chat. So the first question, are these just Texas firms or all US? I think, again, the idea was most of you are here in Texas, but you might have offices in other parts of the US as well.
I think probably most of us have projects and offices throughout. This is our entire portfolio, so it is California and Texas. I will say that it is harder in Texas, and one of the things that drew us down is because we're growing our practice in Texas, and California has requirements for renewable energy and higher sort of energy standards that don't show up in Texas. But I will say that that doesn't mean that our Texas projects consistently underperform. It just means that we have to focus a lot more on the passive strategies, and we really have to build the business case for our Texas clients in a way that is not as difficult as it is in California, where there's just higher minimum code standards.
Yeah. And then Eva's got a question about just how long it takes from signing up to using energy modeling. So I think it sounded like, again, it took everybody a couple of years to get rolling, right, after signing up.
I think it's I mean, I can't speak for anybody anybody else, but it's a constant evolution. I think, you know, if we
Yeah.
start talking about things that are challenges, for us, it's consistency. We have pockets of the firm that do a great job and pockets of the firm that we have to drag kicking and screaming. So I think it is an ongoing and ever present challenge.
And I think that,
Yeah.
you know, there's that old sign that used to be, you know, on the office manager's wall that says answers $1, answers correct $2, dumb looks are still free. And that's been my experience with energy modeling, where we work with people who can produce an energy model under duress, but then you have to learn critical reading of them and getting a better sense of what their assumptions were, because you can get all kinds of numbers. You can get, and the difficulty is human nature is, if you get a number that looks great, you don't question it. If you get a number that looks terrible, you do, and that will tend to bias things in a bad way. So you try to hold yourself to the discipline of, is this number make any sense at all? And with the proliferation of energy modeling packages that produce really pretty graphics, that's the worst. And so it's one thing to start to energy model, but as you get more experience learning how to critically read a report and talk it through with the engineers to understand if you actually believe the numbers.
Yeah, great. Okay, let's go to Allie. You want to go next?
Sure. So I only have 2 slides in here. So my name is Allison Wilson. I am an architect and the sustainability director at Air St. Gross. We are headquartered in Baltimore with physical offices in DC and in Arizona. And then there's a dozen of us like myself who have been long-term full-time remote employees. And so we really do have a nationwide portfolio. So the data that you're seeing on this slide, blue bars are us, gray bars are the 2030 program, and sort of everybody who's reported into this. And these are largely institutional or higher ed projects. We do have some developer work, and that's captured in here as well, but it is certainly not the majority of our portfolio. And so you can see, you know, within reason, at least in the past couple of years, we've started to outperform the industry average, but there was a solid 2018 to 2021 bracket in there where we were behind industry average and kind of pushing into that space. And sort of, you know, I'll take my commentary kind of in the line of some of the questions that are in the chat. The consistency of energy modeling for us has also been about which projects are going to yield value. So, you know, to Ellen's point about, right, like if you're only working with 2030 between January and March to get your data into the DDX and it's an accounting exercise, that's great. That is a very important, useful place to start. And also, chances are your projects carry over multiple years. And so you're going to hold them on your DDX books, right, for 2030 over multiple years. And if you know that that project was not helping you in 2023, 2024 is a great year to try to do something about that, whether it's commissioning an energy model, whether it's, you know, working with that design team specifically, because to Z's earlier point, right, it's got a huge square footage and you know it's driving the results of what's happening in your overall 2030 reporting. It can help you as sort of a sustainability expert to prioritize where are you going to spend your time, which is not infinite and probably has 4,000 other things you're supposed to be doing with it too. Where are you going to spend your time to get the biggest impact on your reporting results? And so, you know, this year, we don't do a monthly update on 2030, but this year, kind of in response of like, cool, we've got momentum. How do we keep this momentum going? We had a conversation in, let's call it June, July of 24 that says, hey, you know, same as I get a list from our CFO of every project anybody has billed against in the prior year. And that's sort of where I start collapsing down to what are we going to report on for that count for the previous calendar year. And cool, like I know based on when what those projects were at plus or minus December 31st of 2023, how many of them are still going to be part of our reporting for this 2024 year when I go to do that in March of 2025. Great. It means I also know which ones of them don't have energy models that would be great for us to have energy models done on in 2024 so that our data can better reflect reality when we go to submit it in 2025. And so that led to a really productive conversation with our powers that be to say, hey, we've got these 10 or 12 buildings that realistically we should have energy modeled, and we didn't for a variety of reasons, whether it wasn't contracted or whatever, fine. So the intervention point then was great. We can't afford to energy model 12 projects outside of contract. That's not a reality, right? Awesome. When you do higher ed work, a lot of that is student housing work. And those are relatively repeatable projects for which, you know, it's kind of going to be the same every single time, or within a relatively small amount of error bars every single time. Great. We're not going to energy model the 3 or 4 projects that fall into that typology out of that dozen or so projects, because the results are not meaningfully going to impact how we design the next one because of the other factors that are in play for that typology. But for the 5 academic buildings that are part of that dozen that really make a difference, that are going to, you know, that the data would be useful to us from both being able to report more concretely into 2030, as well as provide value to our future marketing and business development efforts in that space, we're going to make that investment. And it's both an overhead investment from a sustainability standpoint, but it's also saleable inside our firm to be able to talk about it as a marketing and business development expense as well, for how we're going to talk about that project moving forward in our portfolio. So there's sort of that aspect to it as well, and getting ahead of it. Similar to Z on the next slide, we've had the same experience related to lighting power density. You know, if you've got good, strong LED or primarily LED light package, this is not an issue, especially, you know, hitting that 25% is not a stretch. And you can see we hit it the vast majority of years. There are a couple of years where we haven't had any interior only projects, which is why there's a couple of years with no data. But within reason, you know, that's been a pretty easy one for us to hit. And it has changed the discourse. You know, I imagine it could be kind of intimidating to look at, like, and we have this 13 years of data to be looking at, right? Like, that's awesome. This data meant absolutely nothing for probably 2 or 3 years, because it's not enough data points to start to be meaningful. But I would also say that, like, it starts to become valuable pretty quickly once, like, even with 2 data points, you start to know, like, cool, are we trending one direction or the other? And then you add a third data point, and all of a sudden, like, it becomes increasingly more and more valuable. And so, you know, the way to get to having a larger set of data that you can make more meaningful inferences from is to start somewhere, start anywhere, start wherever you are today, and let that start to be sort of the first step toward having that trajectory and toward having that excellence.
Okay, awesome, great. Let's go ahead and do Jill real quick with a couple slides from her, and then we'll go back to the Q&A questions. So go ahead, Jill.
Yeah, thanks guys, and honored to be on this panel with these folks. I do totally agree. This is can be completely intimidating when you see these years of data, but I'll tell you, those first almost 10 years on that, these 14 years we've been reporting, it was like only our best projects or only the ones we had energy models. So that was a first step. Like, I think sometimes we get caught up in the AIA 2030 and all the technical things around this. And at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is just add a new metric by which we evaluate good, right? And that's the change management of this work that's so important. We're all familiar with, you know, dollars per square foot. When Z was explaining EUI, I always compare, hey, you guys know what the ranges are that you work with in your client type or in this building type. EUI is just another version of that, or what is the energy use intensity of this building type? And it's a new way for us to talk about it that helps us level set. So I want to share just a couple of things. One, this is a work of a lot of people over so many years. We weren't 100% reporting until 2019. And so you'll find too, as you report just part of your portfolio, that bar might jump or move around because it doesn't have all the bad stuff and the good stuff. The other part that's been hugely successful for us is that internal transparency. And it's okay if you don't have energy modeling on all of your projects. Most places you're working have some kind of energy code. And we saw that really come out when we looked at our projects by location. So we could see in some places we're not performing as well. Well, probably they weren't held to the same kind of energy code, and you can always use a default of that. I appreciate the EDR approach, which just says we always want to design to the most stringent, but that's maybe not something that we can do at the scale of our firm. I will say this data also represents over 18 million square foot that's in design in 2023. So back to Z's point on what matters, I think as a larger firm, we've had a harder time getting those higher numbers because our portfolio is just so broad. So reporting both at the office level and at the market sector level has been hugely helpful. And to you know, none of us want to shame anyone, but competition is powerful. And so our market sectors now need to be including some of this in their goals for the year and how they're working on it, how the offices are setting their own strategic goals, but sharing this data is half of it so that you get more people involved and it's not just a small subgroup working to advance efforts. Next slide. I wanted to kind of just synthesize a few things. You know, first is focus on the things that matter. Set those goals. Do we want to talk about it? What's our internal goal as a project team member, and what's our client goals? I think we can get too caught up in the energy modeling part, you know, and if we focus on those prescriptive best practices that we know are there, that we can rely on that. That's such a huge part of the puzzle. And then the energy modeling, let's use it when it can make design decisions and help us, you know, inform decision making and not just as a compliance tool. And then measure progress, right? You don't value the things you don't measure. Like I mentioned before, transparency has been huge for us. So I'll drop a link. But our data here we share publicly, and we've made this our sustainability action plan, not just in a single document sitting on the shelf, but we update it annually as part of our disclosure. So we're trying to combine both our strategy and our progress into a single document so it feels relevant and current for people. And we just published it last week, so please go check it out. But we talk both about our environmental impact and our community social responsibilities. And then I think before we get into our panel, it is really easy to go through a wormhole of like splitting hairs on the CVEX database and what's eligible and what's not. And all of that is really important when you're sitting in front of a spreadsheet trying to figure it out. But sometimes that can distract us from the things that do matter. And the last thing I'll say is as we see this increase in reduction, which feels counterintuitive, but this improvement in projects, people are going to get into the nitty gritty and focus more on on-site renewables because there's only so much efficiency we can squeeze out of it. And we're going to start talking about grid intensities, and those are all important, but don't let it distract from just doing the things we can control on the site, you know, and what we have responsibility over. But no, there's going to be some ancillary things that are just frankly really important in this larger system of decarbonization of our built environment.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Jill. I have everybody's email address here, so if you also have questions with these people that you want to ask them offline or later on, you can feel free to reach out to them or to Becky and I or others to ask questions. Let's go to the chat now. Let me start looking back at some of these. Sorry, I have to get caught up now.
You want to drop screen share just so we're all looking at each other?
Yes. Yep.
And maybe Z, you responded
Questions
to
for Z, yeah.
Yeah, do you want to articulate or voice out what you were typing up there?
You know me, I love articulating.
How much of- yeah. Go ahead.
Pamela, just to repeat from the chat world, people notice, okay, we're the smallest firm, I think, on this call. So we have typically throughout this whole reporting period, I think when I started in 2009, we were 35 employees, but we've had sort of around 50 for a long time. And then the last 2 years grew to 63. So we're the smallest firm. We typically have 1 to 3 million square feet in design in each reporting year. And so what happens is a couple of big projects can also cause some noise in your data when you're a small firm, and you're just that's just the way it works. And so sometimes you look and you say, oh, what a big improvement. It's because, yeah, that sucky developer project is finally no longer.
Really good one.
Yeah, or that really good one. Can't we keep working on that really good one for one more year? Yeah. So, you know, try to take it, you know, seriously, but not literally. But for us, our big improvements, there was a question from Jill. It said, when we saw these big jumps, we saw kind of 2 big step functions. And one was, we didn't have in-house energy modeling until around 2015. And someone joined the firm who had that capability, who was an architect, but also was really good at that. And so that allowed us to do a lot of filling in, because a lot of the engineering firms with whom we worked couldn't do it in-house, or we couldn't browbeat them into doing it. So that made a big difference. And so that hiring somebody in who has that skill set, but can also contribute and do other billable work, if you're a small firm, is great. If you're a 3-person firm, that's really tough. So it is what it is. And we've just gotten better at kind of demanding it for our larger projects. And then the other thing, more periodic check-ins helped a lot. And then in-house what tools we use. It was whatever that person liked to use. You can't browbeat. We've tried using, like, they're the tools that produce the really great graphics, but we think have questionable accuracy, and we won't name them or shame them, but you know who they are. If the prettier the graphics, the probably less accurate the model is. But we had Open Studio, and then we had eQuest, which is like the really old school granddaddy one. But we had a guy in his mid-30s, and that's what he'd always used, and he was willing to work for us. We said, great.
And I want to say
yeah, go
something on
ahead.
that point too, because I think early modeling is less about the accurate, this is my EUI, and more about the comparative. And I think it's so important to say, what's the design question I'm asking, and can modeling help me answer it? Because I can model, you can model anything, right? But if it's not helping you make a design decision, then it kind of can be an ineffective use of time. So I think back to how do you provide value? So we always focus those early simple blocks on like, well, compare this one to this one. So if they're both inaccurate in some form or fashion, they're comparatively inaccurate, and at least helps me understand, is this a better option than that one? I will say also, a lot of folks coming out of school are very versed in the Rhino world, and there's some really great free with
Climate Studio,
the Ladybug tools. So there's some really, those young folks are interested and passionate about it. And I think to Z's point, it's important that when you get that data out, you also understand what it means. And so there is a level, it's not just running the model, but also knowing, well, is that feel right? So there's more tools that are accessible, and we also need to grow the literacy of what that means, but we don't want to overcomplicate it.
One year we had a research fellow who was really good at playing with the Rhino. There's a thing called the simulation game that runs with Rhino, and you're given what are called diva dollars, and you build any form, and then you get to spend certain amount on better insulation or a ground source heat pump or this or that. And what we did was we did this on a Friday afternoon where we gave everyone drinks and we put them on teams, and then they all had to competitively, and people get so wrapped up in it, right? And cheering and so on and so on. And that was a great way to just build interest about this. Isn't just the province of all of the nerds, and got people really excited about it. And I think that's really good. But I love Jill's point that it's all about, we're the architects, and when it comes down to the tweaks of the mechanical systems, that's not our job. For those of you who are integrated firms, it is your job. But for those who are in architecture-only firms, but we did do a thing where we do what we call design bumpers or guardrails, where at the kickoff, we'll say, okay, your courthouse is this big. If you oriented east-west and you put all your glass north and south, here's how good it could be. If you orient it the other way and have all the glass facing the wrong way, here's how bad it could be. And then here's the sensitivity to the total window wall ratio. And we just kind of built an intuition about how much those choices mattered. And then we just stepped away for like a whole design cycle and let them run with that. So I think developing those intuitions that are all relative, mostly focusing on the things that are in the architect's control. I think Corey Squire, who started out in the world of doing, let's say, energy model everything, his thing now is just stop overglazing your frickin' buildings. And so, he at Bora, his firm, they basically try for a window wall ratio around 30%. We try that as the design point. We know that, I think it's Ilana Judah of Arab says, glass is like sugar. It's like processed sugar. It makes things taste great, but if you have a meal of nothing but sugar, you get diabetes and it doesn't actually taste all that great. So using glass well makes things taste great, and using glass excessively just sets you up for a world of pain.
Yeah. Allie, were you going to chime in on this discussion?
I was, but I forgot now my point because we've gotten many
Do you
things.
all, I can't remember your design firm, right? You don't have in-house engineering.
We do not have in-house engineering.
So do you have modeling in-house, or do you use outside consultants as well?
This is a good reminder of what I was going to talk about. So other things that happen in your data over time, beyond the fact of like you have the big project that's, a tank that's either driving your results up or driving your results down, is you'll start to see fluctuations in where projects are in their life cycle and the proportion of your portfolio that is in a particular chunk of your life cycle. So some of those years where our numbers are less than industry average, it's because we had a lot of work that was really early in the process as well, where we, you know, I am pro energy modeling for a variety of reasons, but I'm pro energy modeling that, to Jill's point, helps you make good decisions. And an energy model that has massive error bars on it that's only useful for comparison is kind of not something I'm going to report to 2030 because it just doesn't matter, and that's not the hill I'm going to die on. But if we've gotten something through DD and like we know what it is with a certain amount of specificity and can like really energy model it and make some better choices, like cool, that's useful data. The error bars are smaller. I like that data. So I think that's something also to be aware of like there are a variety of reasons why your data might look like it goes backwards, and it's not because it's actually going backwards. It's because you either have, you know, bigger error bars on the data because it's more your portfolio is an earlier phase stuff, or other sorts of components that drive that. And one of the other reasons that energy modeling still matters and is so important is that Jill started talking about the larger contextual things of onset renewables, offset renewables, etc. When we work primarily for institutional clients, many of them have solved their scope 2 emissions at an institutional scale that has nothing to do with the specific project that we're dealing with, but has everything to do with like, we've just bought RECs for the entire campus and are done with it.
Mhm.
Fine. The only way as a design firm that I can take credit for the fact that my client has made good choices at their scale is if I have an energy model that lets me split the electricity consumption of that project from the natural gas consumption of it. And so that's another component of it as well, of like just why some of these other initiatives have other benefits in the reporting cycle.
Yeah. And I would just add real quick too that again, I know some of the firms that are on the call and elsewhere in the state don't have in-house modeling. And that's not okay if you don't. There is some very good MEP firms or sustainability consultants that can do this for you. And again, I think sometimes people think of a lead energy model, and this is not that. So again, the cost hopefully is just for what you're trying to get out of this, not submitting for like a third-party certification like LEED or something where it's going back and forth again. So just, again, if you all, need more thoughts about local engineering firms that might be able to help if you don't have that in-house. Ellen, were you going to chime in on this too?
Yeah, I was,
Yeah.
so I'm representing a firm that does have one in-house energy modeler, which is a luxury that I recognize
Yeah.
is afforded to some of the bigger firms. We also have MEP engineers on staff, primarily serving the California projects. So they're able to deal with the compliance models, which to your point, Chris, is a much different beast than some of the early phase stuff. I will say though that I think it's a little bit of a double-edged sword to have dedicated in energy support, because it, whether consciously or unconsciously, can absolve everybody else from having to pay attention to it because you just think somebody's going to come in and tell you what you need to hear. So we really are pretty clear-eyed about trying to put the onus for some of the early phase stuff, the massing and the orientation and the amount of glazing. Those are design decisions, right? Those should live and die with the design teams. They shouldn't be relying on anybody to come in and sort of run some sort of analysis to give them that feedback. So we spent a lot of time trying to train on tools where possible, but there's also some great free resources that can give you some of those rules of thumb, like what is it? Is it Climate Consultant, where you can start to, it'll give you kind of a range per your project type and per climate zone of some of the strategies that are going to be the most important to you. It's going to look different from Texas to Minnesota to California. And the 2030 materials palette similarly has a lot of good sort of advice on things to consider that are specific to program and project type. So I would say that there are a tremendous amount of resources to just get you started, even if you're not ready to dive into buying some of the fancy software.
Jill, that's great, Ellen. Jill, do you want to touch a little bit about, again, when you don't have energy models, how we address those?
Yeah,
Yeah.
AIA leverages the work done by the DOE that really compares each energy code cycle against the 2003 benchmark. So if you're in Texas and designing to the ICC 21, it's 50%, right, is the rough order of magnitude. And while yes, we can split hairs around, it's probably different per different client building types. For the most part, that's a pretty good default. So please don't let not having energy modeling keep you from reporting, because you can always just leverage where you're at and what your code is that you're working from. Yeah, perfect. See?
Yeah, so this is when you say, I don't have an energy model, but I'm designing to this code, the 2030 DDX will put in an across the board average savings. And as Jill just alluded, this is savings across all building types, and your mileage may vary because for each code cycle, it could be that medical office buildings got a lot better, but labs didn't, and so on. So it's just a kind of, it's a very crude default, but it means that, again, it's another way. If you're like a small practice and you're feeling like, oh, I'm going to feel so depressed if I just, we don't have any energy modeling for our projects. We're doing these little things. If you just, are designing to the latest code as your defaults for your envelope and so on, you're doing a solid for your client anyway, because you're saving them money long term, and it's usually not driving up the cost very much at all. And you're there at 52% savings, and so you can hold your head pretty high. So it's a thing you can do. There were a number of questions, Ellen or anybody else who wants to talk to it, about how you kind of start at the top. What percentage of your products or projects do you report? I think last year I realized that we had 80 project numbers, but we only had 20 projects that, we did a lot of studies, we did a lot of things that it made no sense to talk about them and so on. So maybe, do people want to disclose? I think there's this onerous fear of how heavy the load will be, because I'm supposed to report everything. But I think the goal is, to start reporting something. So can people talk about how they kind of put on their training wheels and got going?
Yeah, I'll tell you from a high level, and then Allison, Ellen, I think you guys have a bit more robust on some of your check-ins throughout the year. But for us, it's, there's things we're doing throughout the year, but when it comes to January, we're also pulling a report of how much time was spent per project and kind of sorting by what are the projects we spent the most time on. If it was a project that was on our books from last year that we'd already reported AIA 2030, we just kind of checked in and we knew there was still design work on it, and we could either re-report the same numbers or the updates. And then we go through the rest of them and figure out was there a substantial amount of design work done? Sometimes things we've already issued IFCs and maybe they're still billing to the project, but they're really not changing that much. And so those ones we don't report. Or to Z's point, maybe there's some really early preliminary stuff, but it didn't really get into any place substantial that we could quantify. So some of them we kind of make a threshold of a certain amount of hours, maybe if it's less than 200 hours, we're just going to say, nope, not reportable, because we're a large firm. But so we have to use some of those qualifiers just to help focus on the ones that do matter.
Yeah, I will say that's probably a similar story. I've been at a couple of different firms in the last 5 or 6 years, and I can say that it's a similar kind of screening process. Sometimes it's by hours, sometimes it's by contract amount, sometimes it's by square footage. But the name of the game in all instances is to sort of start with the projects that have the opportunity for the biggest impact. And a lot of times those are the biggest projects, or the projects that you're catching early enough to influence the design versus just reporting them. So there is, I think, a number of different ways to prioritize based on impact. And then at some point there is a cutoff. You don't, worrying about a 5,000 square foot, I don't know, like renovation of a classroom is, not going to give you the same level of opportunity or impact as a 1 million square foot hospital will. So just looking at ways to prioritize, I think, in whatever way makes sense with your accounting structure, your reporting structure. I think it'll get you mostly to the same spot.
Yeah, I think building from what both of you have said, I don't include anything that's paper architecture. So if we did a study for something, or it was programming or whatever, and it did not continue past that getting into something, right? That, you know, it's that's not to say projects that go on hold get excluded. If it goes on hold, that's different. I still have it on various years of reporting, if regardless of kind of when it went on hold. But if we never got out of that programming study type space, I don't include it in our reporting. And, you know, we were saying before this call started that I also cut off anything that isn't far enough into either concept or SD for me to know how big it is and what it is and what energy code it has. You know, we know our sites, right? So like, okay, cool, I'm going to know what energy code it is. But if we're still early enough in programming that, like, you know, we have absolutely no idea quite yet how big this thing is, I tend not to include those projects. And then the DDX will let you report on projects that are in construction administration, and it will let you provide post-occupancy data. I cut off at 100% CD, unless we had so many like ASIs or changes during construction that like it actually did influence the performance of the building in a substantive way. But that it's those two extrema that is where stuff gets weird.
Allison, I have a question on that. It used to be that I thought it didn't even like include that in your firm-wide performance. If you said it was in construction now or in CA, is that still the way the bid is set?
I'll be honest, I don't know in the reporting piece, but same thing, like since we started, I think as early as you guys did with the reporting, right? Like the CA projects never were included. And so we wanted to stay self-consistent. So we held that line even when the option became available to include projects in CA, because I didn't want our numbers to get weird. And they may not anyway, but I was reticent to play with that.
So the AIA does do these nice, what are called office hours, where the people and volunteers plus the AIA staff, as reporting gets imminent, you can come onto these Zoom calls and ask questions. And that's actually, I've missed the one for the last year, but that's actually a question I would love to get a straight answer to.
Yeah, that would be a good one, Z. We should follow up on that.
I want to tell a couple of post-occupancy stories. I have a whole slide presentation on this, which I will not share. But
we'll do that next time.
Yeah, next time. I think doing post-occupancy where in the sense of finding out if people are comfortable and did you get the acoustics wrong, that's always really valuable, because you'll be able to become a better designer, and B, if that client ever does another building, the fact that you showed any interest at all in the building after it was occupied is going to stand you in good stead with them. It also gives you better credibility if you say, hi, I want to spend this money on a higher performing system, and the client, well within their rights, says, how do you know it will actually save me money? And so if you can show from post-occupancy measurements that it did, that gives you great credibility. We've found projects where the energy use started off okay, and then 2 months in, somebody came in and overwrote all the settings on the building management system, and the building energy use doubled. And then we got it recommissioned. We flew in the guy and he reloaded all the settings, and the building energy just goes shunk, and it goes back to what it was supposed to be. And so it's kind of setting off an alarm bell, and but it's a really great thing to do. We have a lot of projects where they just use them a little more intensely than we expected. So we energy modeled an apartment building, and it turns out then the pandemic hit and everyone became work from home. And so instead of the setback thermostat kicking in and all that, they're actually there, 24/7. And so the energy use is going to be higher, and that's okay. The weird ones is we have high performing buildings where we think the operator, like a school we have, where we think the operations staff, what he said to us is, the bills are so low that the bills are actually 50% higher than our model said. But he says, these bills are so low compared to any other school I've worked at, I don't want to mess with this system. I just leave it on all the time. So even if no one's in the classroom, they leave the ventilation running and all kinds of things. And so like, it's really hard to overcome that, but you could do even better. But they don't want to hear that. More questions, other people.
Yeah, we have about 3 or 4 minutes left, so I know we're running out of time. So definitely get your questions in. Allie, you want to respond to this one about, or anybody, I guess, about breaking out renovated versus existing versus new construction, that kind of stuff. So a couple of
Yeah, so when you report it itself, you report whole building or major renovation as part of it. So chunks of that do come out. But I would say once we've had our data in there, we've also been able to separate it into other chunks. So you can automatically get it to do like office by office, but you can also get it like once you have the data, you can export all of it as a CSV file to do whatever other manipulations you want to do after the fact on it. And we've found that to be really useful to answer just other questions that the DDX wasn't necessarily designed to answer, but the data is already there. It's already formatted in a self-consistent way that then you can manipulate it to do a lot of other things. So even that part of the exercise has value beyond just the public reporting part.
To share this one result of, for the person who wanted to look at renovation versus new construction, in 2019, we looked at both the embodied carbon and the operational carbon, 1 year operational carbon we sorted our projects. We had, 1 million square feet of new construction and 500,000 square feet of major renovation. And what we found was, not surprisingly, the embodied carbon, upfront carbon in the bright green here, is much higher for new construction, of course. The weird thing was, averaged over our whole portfolio, the operating carbon emissions, which is kind of tracks to energy use, was the same for our major renovations as it was for our new construction. We had a LEED Platinum new building in EUI 26, and we had a major renovation of a crappy 80s office building, which was at EUI 27. So we've found, that's a little bit of cherry picking, but just to say that renovations are really an incredibly cool opportunity for all of us going forward. And I think it's about half of the AIA's work now.
Well, I was just going to say, I feel like this whole thing started with operational energy and tracking that. And we've all evolved in understanding just how much the embodied carbon and the carbon associated with the materials plays. And I don't feel like AIA 2030 reporting has fully caught up to that.
Yeah.
And to Z's point, I think we're all trying to do that and use those tools like Epic, because exactly that, if the next few years are critical, then it's almost like the embodied carbon matters more than our energy use, but we're all still tracking EUIs. So I don't want to, once again, that's another important part of this whole conversation, is we're looking at carbon in two chunks, but both are important to building rigor. I say all the time, intention requires rigor. And so this, to me, the tracking of this, the reporting, this is all the rigor to follow through on what we know is an important intention, in our industry right now.
Yeah. Well, great. And I think, yeah, Beth, thanks for your comment too, being a smaller firm here in Dallas. Appreciate the thoughts there. Yeah, so I think this was great. I appreciate definitely all four of y'all for joining us. I think hopefully for the audience, hopefully you got out of this is that there's different ways to tackle this, right? There's no one easy way or there's no one right way. Just get started, get going. Know that we're all here helping each other and happy to help you all as well. And again, I think just getting that measurement going and starting to be able to compare is going to help you as your company as well. Any final thoughts from the group before we
The only
close
thing I'd
off?
say is that AIA Framework for Design Excellence is so
Yes.
flush
Yep.
with resources and materials. So I think there's often like, where do I start? And that's part of the problem, is we're in information overload, but that's such a great place to go. Look at the energy resources that are there, so that you can
make a
Yeah.
similar plug for the AIA's document about how to create a sustainability action plan that works.
Mhm.
I think that
Yeah.
that document is really good because it is agnostic to the conditions of your firm, the size of your firm. There is something there for everything. Jill, to one of your earlier points, so much of this is about change management, and that's where that document starts. So one of the links that was in Chris's early slides was that creating a sustainability action plan that works. And so I would highly encourage you to take a look at that if you're not sure where to start.
Just dropped it back into the chat.
Wonderful, thank you.
Anybody else? You all good?
On time, on budget.
Yeah, well, again, appreciate everybody's time. We'll have a recording. We have the PowerPoint slides. If anybody needs all this, please let us know. Becky, anything else from TXA?
No,
Thought
thank you
things?
so much. This has been lovely. Appreciate you.
Okay, of course, yeah. Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.